Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is the Byte Show. And right now, we have the most brilliant researcher and just all-around good guy on the line, Joseph P. Farrell. And Joseph has written a lot of books, and he does a lot of research, deep research, and he is probably going to need a new computer or something. You know, we've got to keep this man funded. We just have to. We have to keep him funded. So march over to his website, GizaDeathStar.com, and use that PayPal button. Hi, Joseph.
Hi, Georgie. Thanks for that. I didn't mean my rant prior to the recording of the show about my computer woes to trigger that. It's just been, I don't know. This has been a nightmare, but thank you, hon. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Well, what is this business? They're searching the head of the IMF, their house in Paris?
Oh, boy.
The police?
Yeah, Christine Lagarde. I don't know what that's about, GeorgeAnn, but the way I look at it right now is that if there is a story like this in the financial world,
mm-hmm.
it's connected to every other story in the financial world that we've been hearing for the last decade. And probably, in my opinion, GeorgeAnn, all of this financial woes goes back to what I talked about in covert wars and breakaway civilizations, namely that the United States after World War II set up a vast system of completely off-the-books finance.
Yeah.
And that it was based, and people have written me and said, well, what you're saying won't work. Well, I'm not saying that it will work. I'm simply saying this is what they did.
Yeah. Yeah.
But obviously it's not working.
Right.
So, I'm not disputing the workability of it. But no, I think all of this is just deeply connected to all of that, and that there's been, for quite some time, there's just been wholesale fraud taking place on the part of major banks and banksters and banking families. I have no doubt that these people are only in it for themselves. They care not anything for their depositors or customers or what have you. And that, at these top levels, you're just dealing with, mafiosi copy in the guise of bankers. That's all you're dealing with. You're dealing with thieves, crooks, and in Christine Lagarde's case, I suspect there's something like this going on, given the amount of money that was alleged that she gave to Nicolas Sarkozy.
Yeah.
This is just the revolving door between the corporatocracy and governments that we see in the West. And this means the corruption is endemic and it's systemic.
Yes.
And I suspect that you have, and people don't get this about me. I'm not proposing a worldwide bankster conspiracy, that's all being controlled by the House of Rothschild or any such thing. I think what you have is a multi-factional phenomenon, much like the mafia.
Yeah.
And, they can gather around green top tables and smoke cigars and sip brandy on one day and order the executions of each other on the next. This is the kind of people you're dealing with.
Yeah.
So, outwardly they can present a facade of calm and resolution and agreement and clear-headed thoughtfulness, and all the while they're shooting and sniping at each other. So there's that's going on. But I also suspect that you have within pretty much every government in the West, certainly in France, I know that you have a rather vocal opposition to all of this, and it's been there for quite some time. I would suspect also that you have people within various agencies, of various governments, that are trying their best to expose all of this and bring these people to whatever justice remains. So my thoughts about her specifically are kind of the same as my thoughts about what's going on generally in the banking world. Just more evidence of corruption. And indeed, if she committed a criminal act, she needs to go to jail.
Yes.
And I'm getting to the point, I think, it goes against my nature altogether, but I'm getting to the point of just saying, round up all of these high banksters and throw them all, and their families too, into jail for the rest of their lives. I mean, the criminality and the corruption is just so endemic, but that's the problem. Just rounding these people up and throwing them into jail isn't going to fix the problem. The problem is systemic corruption. That's the problem. So it's going to be interesting to see where all this heads. Obviously I'm not in favor of rounding all these people up and throwing them and their families into jail.
Yeah.
That's just not right either. But at times, you just feel so frustrated with what you see going on, and the fact that these fat cats get fatter and fatter and get off scot-free or with a slap on the hands, and the poor people of Greece or Cyprus, they're left holding the bag for all these people. It's just that's the criminality of it.
Yes, it certainly is. And I want to get into more about Cyprus, but in a minute.
Okay.
There was a writing on France24.com, and the title of it is Revolt Against City of London's Medieval Elders.
Right. I saw that article.
Yeah. It's a very good article.
Yeah.
And the last comment that is made in that article is, London's economic future depends on the reform of financial services.
Right.
The alternative to reform, in quotes, of the corporation is not the status quo, it's revolution.
Right. Well, look, this is really what's going on. I've taken the long view, and this will be more apparent once the sequel to Babylon's Banksters is out. That should be out sometime in October. I take the long view that, in fact, it's a very long view, that what we've seen as the Western financial system is in part the accident of several factors within history very long ago, and in part the result of deliberate collusion on the part of these banking elites, and that process itself beginning long ago. And I do take the view of Webster Tarpley that I think it's fairly clear, if you dig long enough and hard enough in history, to see how the northern Italian banking elites simply moved headquarters from places like Florence and Genoa and Venice, moved northward. They had their agents in central and southern Germany, certainly during the period of their operation, and then, when they closed all that down, they helped fund Spain and Portugal and the exploration of the New World, and they shifted their base of operations northward eventually to Amsterdam, and then finally over, to what became the City of London.
Yeah.
And we need to remember that charter is a medieval charter, but there's kind of two events that we have to look at. It's that medieval charter itself, and then secondly, with William III, the founding of the Bank of England in 1694, and of course they brought William over from the Netherlands. William Stadtholder becomes William III of England.
Yeah.
So this is all one big murky story. The first thing that the story tells us is it's wrong simply to look at a bunch of Jewish banking families. What you're really looking at is a class of people within Europe, within the European nobility, both Jewish and Christian, that are doing this. So I think that's part of the story. I take the long view.
Joseph, I don't mean to sidetrack, but how come so many people kind of have the idea that, oh no Christian would be involved in this?
Well, I think, GeorgeAnn, in part it's because of our need to have a simplistic explanation that we can grasp a hold of. We need to have what I call the grand unified conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
That it's the Masons that are ultimately behind it all, or it's the Jews that are ultimately behind it all, or the Zionists, or the bankers, or this group or that group. In other words, everybody's searching for a scapegoat.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got the Catholic Vatican Jesuit conspiracy version of it.
Yes.
On and on it goes. And the problem is it doesn't take much digging to find that each of these groups certainly has had sort of a conspiratorial role to play throughout history. The problem is trying to communicate to people. You've got to get away from a unipolar conspiracy and start thinking in terms of factions, and think in terms of mafia families making deals with each other.
Yes.
Trying to get the best slice of the pie that they can, and when they can't get their way, then they start shooting at each other.
Yeah.
That's what's going on, in a word.
Oh.
So you've got geopolitical interests. You've got the national oligarchies, in Germany and France and Russia and Italy and so on. You've got certainly Zionism as a factor. You've got these post-war Nazis thrown into the mix. You've got the bankers. These people are nuts.
Yeah, they are. They're nutty as a fruitcake. That email I sent you, and I sent it out on the list.
Right.
It had a photograph of Putin.
Yes.
Shirtless.
Yes.
With a big rifle.
Yeah.
And the caption, get this, I love this caption, was, "I get gun, I get our money back."
Well, let's go back to, I'll get to Putin in a moment. Let's go back to the medieval charter of the City of London. That article, as far as I'm concerned, is correct in one sense, that, you've had this corporate charter that's created a status of privilege for a certain group of people.
Yes.
Corporations, as we know them, evolve out of the Middle Ages, and hopefully, Dr. DeHart and I are still thinking and talking about doing an Apocalypse Theater Volume 2 and kind of tailoring it around this subject.
Boy, we need it.
Well, the problem is it's such a big subject, and doing it justice without, number one, burying people in a blizzard of footnotes, or number two, having such scarce, threadbare references, it doesn't do anybody a bit of good. Hitting the just balance between the two is very difficult. So, that's our problem.
Yeah.
But I do agree with that article. I think it's necessary. We have to have, and I've been urging this in my website, blogs, and so on, we have to have a long philosophical debate on the origins of corporate personhood, its status within Western jurisprudence.
Yes.
And we have to look at some of these privileged institutions that it has created, the City of London private corporation oligarchy. You could say, certainly a case could be made that you could say the same or similar thing about, the corporation called the United States of America.
Yeah.
But, there's problems with all of that, too. I think the deepest problems that we have are, in fact, cultural. We're seeing the end of a system.
Yes.
And no one really knows what's around the corner. The reason, and I've said this over and over again on your show and in other places, I think the reason that the Western banksters are so panicked is, on the one hand, they've played their game and they've tried to put their pieces, in order,
yeah,
to create a global government at which they're at the helm.
Yes.
The problem is, anytime you approach the end game in what amounts to a confederation of interests, each faction, as it nears the end game, is going to want to be in control. So holding it together, the closer you get to the end, the further the end recedes from you, because the factional interests grow more acute.
Yeah.
Pardon me. So that's problem number one. And I think there's a certain measure of that. Problem number two is there is a cultural transition afoot, and nobody really knows what it means or where it's going. We can all sit and prognosticate about the technological developments and the emergence of local currencies and the internet and what the two might mean and yada, yada, yada. But no one ultimately knows where this is going to end up.
Right.
And the problem for the banksters is they've surrounded themselves with their own in-the-box thinking experts that they cannot hear. And I've said this so many times before, if you surround yourself with yes men, you're only going to hear one thing, and that's yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
God forbid you should, maybe hire a consultant that says maybe or no or you're nuts.
Exactly. Right on.
So, they can't think outside their own self-imposed boxes that they want everybody else to think in. That's the other problem, and I think there's a certain measure of that. They will make every effort to control that debate. They're already showing signs of it. But ultimately, I don't think they have any clue about where to go or how to fix this monster that they've been privy to, other than to try and keep the shell game going as long as possible.
Yeah.
While they try and figure something out. The problem is, like you say, people like Putin aren't going to let them.
Well, I love that. I get gun, I get our money back.
Well, that Putin, let's turn the clock back here and try and think in terms of a Russian nationalist. And I've said this over and over. I've had people from Eastern Europe misunderstand what I'm saying. All right, and I want this to be crystal clear. Even though Putin comes out of the KGB, all right, so in other words, he comes out of the typical Soviet-era centralized authoritarian mentality, all right? The trouble is that this does not make him a communist.
Right.
What it does, what I think he really is kind of a late sort of Tsarist Slavophile, which was a movement that occurred back in the late 19th century inside of Russia amongst Russian academicians that understood that Russian culture was something very unique. It was never going to be, just by the nature of its history, it was never going to be completely Western in the sense that Germany or France would be.
Right.
All right? Because of, again, the religious and cultural background is very different. So Putin, I think, is coming out of that mentality rather than being a throwback, as he's so often painted in the Western media, being kind of a throwback to a quasi-Soviet style regime. I think he's a throwback to something much older.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, coming out of the KGB, Putin will know intimately how it was that the West, and in particular the United States, conspired to use this hidden system of finance to literally steal the Soviet Union's gold reserves right out from under their noses.
Yeah.
And basically to hasten the process of the economic crack-up of the Soviet Union. And then, of course, you remember that Gorbachev was replaced with Yeltsin.
Yeah.
And you had a bunch of, for want of a better expression, Westerners come in and fund the Russian mafia, the communist bosses that end up climbing into bed, quite literally, with Western corporations and bankers and selling off Russia to these people.
Yeah.
For billions of dollars in kickback.
Well, that's what's happening here.
Well, I know. It's the same pattern. They were simply trying to apply it to Russia, and that's why they had to get rid of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Well, to a certain extent, not completely, but to a certain extent, Putin represents the opposition to that policy. So, on the one hand, he certainly protects his own oligarchs. On the other hand, he certainly attempts to make them as independent of the West as he can. This is, I think, the whole kind of geopolitical game that's going on behind Russia's involvement with, the formation of the BRICS nations and so on and so forth. So when Putin says, I'm going to get our money back, he's taking the long view. He's thinking Leo Wanta. He's thinking all of those missing gold reserves. He's thinking George H.W. Bush's reassurances to Gorbachev that, no, we're not going to expand NATO into Eastern Europe. Uh-huh. No, we're not going to try and encircle Russia. Well, that's exactly what the West has done.
Yes. Yes.
So, Putin's coming out of that long history that, Russia's just not going to play that old British game of allowing itself to be encircled. Just not going to do it. And, this, GeorgeAnn, illustrates to me what is so essential for people to grasp about what's going on right now. You have the old 19th, 18th, and even to a certain extent 17th century geopolitical game being played again. Oh. And you've got the same players. The biggest problem for Western geopolitics has been this enormous construction called Russia.
Yes.
And another problem, an enormous population called China.
Oh, yeah.
Those two countries alone can dominate the Eurasian heartland, which, is the key to world domination. So it was always a matter of British and French geopolitics to prevent them from doing so.
Oh.
So we're seeing the same thing. The problem is the United States has taken the place of Great Britain, and Europe has taken the place of the other powers back then. But it's the same game.
Oh, boy.
It's the same game.
Yeah. Well, Cyprus has now turned to Russia for a
bailout.
Yeah.
Well,
can you believe that?
Well, I just got done doing a News and Views today.
Yeah.
On the problem of Cyprus. And I got to tell you, it's very interesting to me. I get a lot of people sending me articles.
Yeah.
It's to the point I do more research in terms of reading people's emails than I do myself surfing the internet because, the volume of emails is that great. And I'm certainly not complaining. I like to see what interests people. And I like to, I like the fact that people are sending me these articles. But people have been literally flooding me with articles about Cyprus.
Oh, yeah.
And it's been very difficult for me to keep up. And in reading the articles, thus far, I came across a rather interesting sequence of events, the way the story itself has played out.
Yeah.
At first, the story was the government of Cyprus was going to seize a percentage of all deposits in Cyprus in order to make good on bad loans and so on, and make good on all of the ties that Cyprus has with the big banks of Europe. All right?
Yes.
And it's them, of course, behind all of these bad loans. So basically, the first version of the story was the government of Cyprus was in the hip pocket of the European banksters who were trying to bail themselves out of their own bad loans by seizing the deposits in Cyprus. Mm-hmm. Then the story changed a little bit, and we started to hear that, what's really going on is the IMF is trying to seize the money of all these Russian oligarchs who are putting their money into Cyprus in order to avoid paying Russian taxes on it.
And they tried to make it okay by saying it's Russian mob money.
Right, and they tried to make it okay by saying it was Russian mob money.
Yeah.
Which it may well be. I don't care. Because the whole basis of all of this is these banksters know, there's not a bank in the West that hasn't done dirty money with dirty people.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Just think J.P. Morgan here, folks.
Yeah, Bank of America.
Or Bank of, all of these big banks. There's not one of them whose hands are clean. But, you can always get away with, well, this manager must have done that on his own initiative. It certainly wasn't bank policy, yada, yada, yada. Well, then the story changed to, yet again, to just prior to Cyprus announcing this action, the Russians had pulled all their money out and beaten the IMF to the punch. And then we heard news from Medvedev and then Putin and then Medvedev again that this was just another signal of how desperate the Western bankers are and what a shambles the system is in. And then finally, as you say, now we hear Russia saying, well, we'll bail you out. Okay? And guess what in return for?
What?
A naval base.
Oh. Oh my goodness.
So, and that just came to me in the last couple of hours. I didn't even have a chance to comment on that in the news and views. So anyway, so let's look at the whole story. What do we have here? Well, if all of these things are true, and I suspect that there's an element of truth to each component of the story, then what I think may be going on is these were shots in an emerging economic, currency, whatever you want to call it, war that's beginning to emerge between the Anglo-American West and the BRICS nations.
Yeah.
With, Russia and China in the lead of that. And I like to call them the BRICS nations now because now South Africa has decided they're going to throw in their lot with them.
Yeah. Smart people.
Well, you can't blame them.
Absolutely no way.
No, because the white minority government of South Africa was propped up for so long by the West.
Yeah.
And then the West turned on the white minority government.
Sure did.
So you can't blame the South Africans for being a little skeptical of their relationship with the West.
I'd use a stronger word than skeptical.
Yeah, well, I'm biting my tongue and smiling as I say that.
Yeah.
But, I suspect that this really was an attempt by the Western banks, under the guise of something else, to seize a lot of these Russian liquid assets and to deal another blow to Putin. Remember that they don't like Putin.
Yeah.
They've got to get rid of this man and what he stands for. Now, I've got news for them. If they think they're dealing with a personality phenomenon in Putin, they're sadly mistaken. Mm-hmm. Putin is the manifestation of something deep and cultural about Russia. And if it wasn't Putin, it would be someone else.
And maybe not as
and maybe not nearly as level-headed or rational.
Yeah, irrational. Yes.
Like it or not, Vladimir Putin is a very articulate head of state and head of government.
Yes.
He's, if you read his speeches and his comments, he's very, very articulate, and you would expect that of someone with a kind of a KGB intelligence analysis background. But the point is, the sooner the West wakes up to the fact that they're not dealing with a personality cult, they're not dealing with another Joseph Stalin.
Yeah.
They're dealing with a man who represents deep-seated analytical trends, analysis, and interests inside of the Russian intelligence establishment. That's what they're dealing with. Mm-hmm. And if it wasn't Putin, it would be someone else. I think that it may be true, it probably is true, that the Russians got at least some of their money out before that action was taken. and then turned right around as the Cypriots are reeling from the news that, hey, our banks may just go ahead and steal some of our money from us in order to make good their fat cats bad loans.
Yeah.
You know, imagine how you or I would feel if, you know, we had, God forbid, our money in a big American bank, and their loans were all so bad, and they had so much invested in credit default swaps that they announced to us, oh, by the way, we're taking 10% of your savings.
I get gun. I get our money back.
I get gun. You know, I dump garbage on president of my bank's lawn.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that sort of thing. So, yeah, it doesn't surprise me that, you know, this may have been an attempted shot fired at Russia that backfired. And backfired in a major way.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the Russians are stepping in and saying, okay, we'll help you out here, Cyprus. We've got enough cash. After all, we just took it out of your banks. And we've got enough cash. We'll bail you out. We'll help the situation here, but we need a naval base.
Yeah. I think
which, given the location of Cyprus and what's happening in Syria right now, you can just see that this is a major thumbing of the Russian nose in the West's face. And, you know, given the nuttiness of Western leaders right now and this urgency they have to take, you know, to take out Syria and then go on toward Iran and all of the stuff that they want to do. You know, this again, I'm trying to emphasize, this is geopolitical. This is all geopolitics.
Yeah. And
the geopolitics has nothing to do ultimately with Syria or Iran. It has everything to do with Russia and China.
Yeah. Well, even Argentina is accusing HSBC of an $80 million money laundering.
Sure.
It's you know,
and that in itself, GeorgeAnn, is interesting because the only other country that has really come right out and accused Hong Kong Shanghai Bank of that kind of money laundering has been the United Kingdom. So strangely enough, the United Kingdom and Argentina are agreed on something for a change.
Oh,
you know, that's a measure of just how weird and strange this world has become, simply because these big banks have gotten away with this crap for so long.
Yeah. I mean, it's endemic with them.
But now here's the thing I want to point out about Cyprus.
Okay.
Most of these austerity policies in Europe are coming out of Berlin.
Oh, yes.
Okay? And I suspect that the German government is simply being used as the cat's paw for the banking interests in Frankfurt and London, all right? I doubt very much that this is a policy solely emanating from Chancellor Merkel's offices, all right?
Oh.
And I suspect that this is a quiet shot across the bow, not only from Russia to the Western bankers, but from Russia to Germany.
Oh.
And I suspect, and I said it on my News and Views this afternoon, I'll say it here, that right now, in terms of the Cyprus crisis, watch Germany and Russia very carefully. Because how they proceed right now is going to say a lot. I suspect that the long-term goal that the Germans have been up to, particularly with these calls that, you know, to the Federal Reserve, we want our gold back.
Yeah.
And the Federal Reserve saying, golly, it might take us, maybe 7 years? Give us 7 years?
Yeah, right. Oh, gee.
I suspect that Germany, as always, given their geopolitical situation, is having to play a very, very delicate dance.
Yeah.
But I think their long-term game, it remains the same. I think they are trying to hold the European Union together so that they can continue to dominate it. But they're also playing a game that if it should fall apart, they have definitely seen that the long-term financial future of the West isn't too good.
Yeah.
The only thing holding, I'll say this again, the only thing that appears to be holding the Western financial system together is American military power and the threat thereof. We're in exactly the situation of Venice. What was holding that thing together was all their money and their ability to use that money to buy extreme military force when they had to.
Yeah.
So, it was a delicate balance. And finally that egg cracked.
Well, I get the feeling that in our lifetime, Joseph, this egg in this country is fixing to crack. I really do.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. If it cracks, it's going to be horrendous. I certainly hope it doesn't. But it cannot continue.
Right.
This system with all of the inbuilt fraud in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping people are understanding once again what I'm saying and what I was arguing in Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations. I'm not saying that this hidden and vast system of financial fraud works. It can work for, a period of time. Mm-hmm. But eventually, all truth comes out.
Oh, yeah.
And that's as true of fraudulent finance as of anything else.
Yeah.
So you had a vast tier of fraud put into place during World War II and afterward. And then on top of that, you added the deregulation of banking and securities in the 80s through the 90s. You add on top of that the mortgage fraud that people like Catherine Austin Fitts detected, and the credit default swaps and creation of derivatives and bundles of bundles and all of this massive paper leverage. You've added yet another tier to this whole thing.
Yeah.
So, the problem is it's so hugely intertwined. This is why the banksters are panicked, because, the idea that they control each and every last little detail of this is absurd. They themselves don't know where the bottom is.
Oh, boy. Well, Webster Tarpley has come out with a lot of information on if Wall Street, with their high-frequency trading, were charged a penny for every transaction, there would be no problem.
Yeah, there wouldn't.
Right. So what is the big hang-up, Joseph?
Well, the big hang-up is they want, quite literally, to suck the wealth out of the middle class.
Yes.
And make us pay for their Obamacare that they sneak through at the middle of the night behind closed doors.
Yeah.
They want all of this pie for themselves. The problem that they have now is that increasing numbers of people around the world are wise to their game. The big problem now, as never before in human history, I've said this before on your show, is that it was easy for the elites to dominate so long as they controlled the information.
Yes.
And the dominant memes. But the trouble now is they're confronted with a little thing called the Internet.
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult for them to control the flow of information. And increasingly, more and more people are reliant upon that for their news rather than their own controlled media outlets, like See No News or Faux News in the United States or CBS. Those mechanisms are no longer available to them.
Phony mind control channel.
Yeah, it's they've got competition, in other words.
Mm-hmm.
And that problem is compounded to a certain extent by officially state-sponsored media like RT, which I find very interesting because, it's a state-sponsored medium. But it's very interesting to me that they have deliberately targeted the Internet audience.
Yes.
They've turned the tables to a certain extent on the Western elites because, that was what was ultimately the undoing of the Soviet Union, was the information technology. It just became impossible for the communist bosses to control the information, and they woke up one day and they were pushing buttons and pulling levers and nothing was happening.
What a glorious sight.
What do you mean they're tearing down the Berlin Wall?
Well, even the Berlin Wall, there's been a big squabble about that lately, too, that contractors and people want to take it down and build high-rise complexes there.
Right.
And the people say, no, that's part of our history.
Right, exactly. Well, you can't blame them. Of course it's part of their history, not a very pretty part, but,
right.
It would be akin to, the Japanese wanting to tear up, the atomic bomb parks in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah.
It would just be unthinkable. No, you can't blame them. But, my point being here that we are in a cultural transition. Nobody ultimately knows where this is going to end up. And you do have several different factions within this thing called the New World Order in the West, and they're all vying for ultimate power. And I think they're all in kind of a increasingly unfriendly competition with each other. And on top of that, you have Russia and China and India and Brazil and South Africa and, the Latin American countries increasingly set up. And the real problem, I'll go right to the heart of it as far as I'm concerned, the real problem is post-Soviet American imperialism.
Oh, yeah.
Pure and simple.
Yeah.
If you were an average Russian or Chinese or Italian or Spaniard looking at the vast military power of the United States and how it is being used, and used in addition to funding these very self-evident so-called spontaneous uprisings in the world, would you feel good or safe or secure in an alliance with that country?
Oh, absolutely not.
I wouldn't. No, of course not. Even we in America, there's an interesting Gallup poll recently that said now, for the first time in its history, the majority of Americans not only do not trust the government, but they fear it.
Mm-hmm.
That's a first.
Mm-hmm.
That's a first. So I think, there has to be a real reassessment of American foreign policy. And
But there's not going to be, Joseph, as long as we've got this oligarch behind everything.
Well, that's the point. That's the point.
And
the system is largely corrupted and co-opted.
Yeah.
But the real debate isn't taking place there. That's the problem. The real debate has moved from their think tanks and universities to the Internet. In other words, before, those things could control the terms of the debate, but now they cannot.
Yeah.
So the real debate is no longer, I'm sorry, Mr. Rockefeller, it's not in your Council of Foreign Relations sponsored papers and meetings and so on, and your secret meetings, Bilderbergs and all that.
Yeah.
The real debate and the real discussion is being had on the Internet.
Yeah.
Now, I think it would be a wonderful, splendid idea that every time the Bilderbergers have a meeting, that, the place of the meeting is not only publicized, but that you have at the same place or close by an anti-Bilderberg meeting.
Great idea.
Just follow these so-called would-be world elites around and mock them.
Yes.
That's all they're good for. Look at their stupid, silly solutions that they've come up with.
Oh, God.
You know, everything from global warming, carbon tax, Obromniak care, you know, now they're trying to limit assault guns in this country, like that's going to stop people from going around and killing each other.
Well, Joseph, I'd like to point out that more people are killed by pharmaceuticals and misdiagnosis by physicians in this country than was ever thought to be killed by guns. A lot of the gun deaths are cops shooting people.
Well, you know, the point of it all is that the system is increasingly perceived as not working for the people.
Right.
It's only working for the few.
Yes.
And like it or not, that's a perception. It may be completely non-legitimate, but the perception is what's driving things right now.
Yeah.
And I just really do think that, you know, it's time to hold the light of mockery up to the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and the Warburgs and the Christine Lagardes and these idiots that are proposing criminal solutions against their own people.
Yes.
And expose them for what they are. Small, wicked, trivial, thieving liars. That's all they are.
Yes. Oh boy, you said it. That's true, Joseph. I'm ashamed of these people.
Well, I am too, you know.
Yeah.
I am too.
And I'm ashamed that they would even think of taking the working person's funds.
Yeah, well, what do you expect from people that don't work, that live parasitic existences?
Yes.
You know, the very, very wealthy and the very, very poor are in a similar spot.
Yeah. In
that respect, except the very poor aren't usually there by their choice. The very wealthy usually aren't either, but they've become parasites in the most insidious way that, you know, they sit around and have their think tanks and their meetings on how to get rid of the excess world population.
Yeah.
Because, you know, they're so used to thinking, well, we want it all for ourselves.
Yeah.
That's the ultimate reason behind all of that.
I bet
It's not that there's too much population in the world. It's that they want it for themselves.
Yes.
And that extra mouths to feed are less wealth for them. Oh. That's the ultimate. It's the old human love of money is the root of all evil paradigm.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Oh, boy. Well, going back to Russia, last year, an article was published, I think, in The Guardian.
Yes.
That Russia was going to refurbish all of its Cold War bases.
Oh, can you blame them?
Absolutely not.
No, again.
Oh, and that includes Cuba.
Well, again, can you blame them?
No.
If we had kept our pledge,
yes,
not to expand NATO into the former Soviet socialist republics like the Ukraine or Bielorussia and so on, or Poland, if we had kept that pledge, would we see the same sort of nervousness on the part of Russia? Mm-hmm. No, I don't think so. The fact of the matter is, and I'm sorry if this upsets people, you know, in the West, but I do believe that there has been a deliberate, consistent post-Soviet collapse policy on the part of the West to encircle Russia.
Yeah.
To render it impotent.
Right.
To expect that in that circumstance, the Russians would not respond. I mean, you know, to them, it's a threat to their national existence.
Yes.
to expect them to sit idly by and let us do that without a response. It's insanity.
Yes,
it's insanity.
Oh, Joseph.
If, I was listening today to Bibi Netanyahu and Obromniak over there in Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
Okay? And I was listening to B.O. in particular saying that, okay, Israel certainly has a right to defend itself, and of course Bibi Netanyahu got up and said that. And B.O. got up and said, well, that's fine, but so do the Palestinians. They have a right to defend themselves. They have a right to peace.
Who said that?
B.O.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, well, good for you.
Yeah.
But then again, so do the Iranians.
Mm-hmm.
So do the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
So does Venezuela. They have a right to dispose of their national wealth as they see fit, not as Western corporations see fit. Is that really why we hated Hugo Chavez? Probably. Is this really why we hate Putin? Yeah, probably. In other words, we'd better get it through our thick, arrogant American heads that we cannot assume to dictate to other countries, powerful ones.
Right.
Because if we keep down this path of arrogance, we're going to end up in the same place that a little country in the center of Europe ended up in 1945.
Yeah. Well,
people are not going to be dictated to.
That's right. And there's a lot more of us than there are of them.
Well, it isn't even that. The problem is the elites, as a friend of mine put it years and years ago when we were discussing similar things, the silos are hardened.
Yeah.
We've got handguns, they've got nukes.
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. The problem isn't that there's a lot more of us than them. The problem is they're trying to treat the oligarchs and elites of other nations as if they were the peasantry of their own.
Yeah.
And that's what's not going to work.
Mm-hmm. The chemical attack that took place in Syria, I thought it was very interesting, the timing of that.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, Assad has called on the UN to do a full investigation about this chemical attack. And I don't think he would have done that if he himself had used these weapons against
Probably not.
his own people.
Probably not. Assad isn't a nice man. He would be capable of pulling a chemical attack and doing a false flag and trying to make it look like the West and then going to the UN and say, oh, investigate this. But by the same token, the fact of the matter is now that I bet everyone in this audience would immediately and first suspect the West of having done this. Now stop and think, GeorgeAnn, of what that means in terms of the shift in perceptions.
Oh, yeah.
15 to 20 years ago, the idea, even in the corruption of the Clinton years or the Bush 1 years, and let's face it, those were extraordinarily corrupt administrations.
Yes.
If that kind of statement had been made 15 or 20 years ago, no one would have believed it. We would not have thought our governments capable of using such weapons or letting any of our proxies use them.
Right.
Now, I rather suspect that our first suspicion goes to our own people or their proxies rather than Assad.
Yes.
That is a huge dramatic shift. That's how bad things are.
Yeah.
And frankly, I'm agreed with you. I don't think Assad would have done that.
Mm-mm.
I don't think he would risk it.
I don't think he's that stupid.
I don't think he's that stupid. Nor do I think he's even that power hungry. I think the West is.
Oh,
I think the people in London and New York and Washington are.
Yes.
Or Paris, for that matter. You can figure out them either.
Yeah.
But again, the reason I can say that is we're dealing with a geopolitical game that ultimately isn't about Syria or Iran. It's about Russia and China.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem.
Yes. And what is going to happen with Japan?
Oh, good question. A really good question. GeorgeAnn, I honestly don't know.
I mean, they're talking, aside from the things that you're going to talk about, the Japanese are talking about having to relocate the entire population of Japan somewhere else because of the radiation.
Yeah. The real problem in Japan, I don't think it's the radiation problem. Eventually, I think they're going to get a handle on fixing that. Although, tragically, I think it's going to require some great sacrifice on their part.
Yeah.
The real problem, GeorgeAnn, Japan, I'm almost hesitant to say what I really think. But, Bismarck back in the 19th century was asked what did he think would trigger the next general European war.
Yeah.
And Bismarck replied, some damned fool thing in the Balkans.
Oh.
And, of course, he was right. I mean, he was very prophetic because that, of course, was exactly what happened with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And that started World War I.
Yeah.
And, I feel like paraphrasing Bismarck, what's the next big tinderbox in the world? And I think it's Japan, certainly the Middle East, but I think the other big one is Japan. And I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Prior to the Fukushima tsunami and earthquake, and then, of course, the reactor meltdown.
Yeah.
Prior to that, there was a very, very interesting thing that was happening in Japan, and it barely made the news over here, of course. And that was a huge change in the governing philosophy in Japan. And I say governing philosophy because that's really, to a certain extent, what it was.
Yeah.
There was the old ruling party had been swept out of the elections, out of power in the elections.
Yeah.
The new government came in with a kind of a program to re-evaluate their ties with the United States. They quietly asked the United States to close down the base in Okinawa, and the reason being that there have been so many rapes of Japanese women on the part of American personnel stationed there that they just had it.
Yeah.
There was talk for a period of a state visit by the Japanese emperor to Beijing. There was all of this reassessment, and it looked like, and even to me, it looked like Japan was making an effort at least to mend some of the fences with the rest of the Asian world, and particularly with the Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And to a lesser extent, even the Koreans, And it's very important for people to understand why this is so crucial. Japan had taken over Manchuria prior to World War II, that whole huge northeastern area of China, which was a very heavily industrialized area as well.
Yeah.
And, basically made it a puppet state, a rump state.
Yeah.
And prior to that, of course, they had taken over the Korean Peninsula and made it kind of, for want of a better expression, a Reich protectorate. And basically just plundered the country. So, the Koreans don't have any love lost to the Japanese. You can't blame them. And certainly the Chinese don't. You can only think of the rape of Nanking and the plunder and so on and so forth and some of the grisly things that were done to the Chinese. So it's understandable. But the Japanese government, the new one, was at least, I think, making a genuine attempt to mend some of those fences.
Yes.
Because, culturally there's a lot more in common between China and Japan. They're both huge economies, it doesn't make sense for the two largest Asian economies to be at loggerheads with each other.
Right.
And, where there's economy, there's also military potential. And additionally, I had always thought that Japan was probably very covertly at work on its own nuclear deterrent if it didn't already have one. And I still think probably it already has one. So all of this was going on, and the Japanese government was then told by then sitting U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, in words that can only be understood as a threat.
Yeah.
There's no other way to evaluate his words. He told the Japanese that they had better reconsider their position, or there would be serious consequences.
Yes.
Now that's a threat.
Yes, it is.
And then shortly after that, of course, we had the Fukushima disaster, we had the reactor meltdowns, and a change, just a 180-degree turn on the part of the Japanese government. Now, why am I going around Harvey's barn with all of this?
Yes, why?
Well, it's because the Japanese people have been in the vanguard of examining Fukushima. Many of them think it was artificial. Mm-hmm. There is an increasingly quiet but growing popular kind of disenchantment in Japan with the United States. Mm-hmm. And we have to remember one very, very important thing about the underground Japanese oligarchy. That oligarchy is the imperial family and the Yakuza, or the Zaibatsu, as sometimes it's referred to. But you've got this extraordinarily interwoven network of all of the old families that were big names during World War II, Mitsubishi and so on and so forth, and the Yakuza. And there is an extremely right-wing element within all of those groups. In other words, there is a hidden right-wing extremism at the very center of the Japanese elite.
Yeah.
And all of this spells to me that in the long run, I think Japan, and I'm not talking about, something that's going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. But I still think Japan is very slowly and quietly, while it courts us and, allows us to build more bases or whatever.
Yeah.
It is eventually going to pull the plug on its alliance with the United States. I see no other course forward for Japan. The pressure economically, geopolitically from the BRICS nations will be too much for the Japanese to ignore. Mm-hmm. Economically and geopolitically, their future is with Asia. So they're watch the Japanese carefully. It's the tinderbox. It's the 21st century Bismarck, some damn fool thing in the Balkans.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, I really do think that.
On a humorous note, I was talking to John, my son, mm-hmm. and you know him.
Yes.
And we were talking about the civility of nations. And he said, well, Mom, look at all the nations that don't produce automobiles.
Right.
They don't produce TVs. They don't produce iPhones. And I got to thinking about that.
Yeah.
And it made a lot of sense.
Well, the big problem really, for the West is if you look at the United States, Great Britain, the two big Western industrial powers, they're no longer industrial powers.
Right.
In Europe alone, of virtually all the major economies there, the only ones that really make a wide variety of things are the Germans.
Yes.
I was just dumbfounded. I put up an article on my website based on the CIA's fact book.
Mm-hmm.
And the article was simply about balance of accounts.
Yeah.
And guess who number one was?
Germany.
Germany. Yeah. Now, I mean, I sat there with my jaw open. That the largest balance of accounts in the world belongs to the country in the center of Europe that, you know, has been at a major center of two big storms in world history.
Yeah.
And is, by that fact alone, you know, is the dominant power in Europe again, obviously.
Well, last year...
And guess who was dead last?
Us.
Us.
Yeah. I believe it, Joseph. Last year, an article came out, I think again in, I can't remember, but Der Spiegel or one of the big news sites, that Germany, the port up in Rotterdam, were hugely busy.
Well, Rotterdam's in Holland.
Not Rotterdam.
You mean Hamburg?
Hamburg. Were hugely busy in building ships.
Oh, yeah.
It was... oh, my gosh. The article went on and on about all the shipbuilding and how lucrative.
Well, you know, if we look at American manufacturing, most of what we manufacture, I bet, you know, I'm just willing to kind of bet a sizable portion of it's going to be defense related.
Oh, yeah.
You know, in terms of heavy manufacturing.
Yeah, weapons.
You know, but, you know, certainly the Germans have a large weapons manufacturing component to their economy. No one would dispute that. But certainly they have a larger consumer base. What interests me is that you're seeing the beginnings of maybe what may turn out to be a quiet little shift in Russian entry into consumer products, because, you know, the Russian economy in the post-Soviet era has been driven largely by trying to leverage its energy resources, and with the expansion taking place in the United States and North Dakota and so on and so forth, that may not be a good long-term strategy for the Russians. So I suspect you're going to see them rethink some of that. They might emerge as yet another competitive economy in that respect. I don't know. It will require a lot. In Russia's case, you're dealing with an infrastructure, an industrial infrastructure that is very dilapidated and out of date in some respects. And will require a lot of retooling. But if they did that, I think you're going to see even more pressure on the West.
Oh.
Yeah, it's you know, the problem is it's no longer a unipolar world, and the United States is behaving like it is.
Yes. Because
it has the world's most powerful military. Well, you know, I'm sorry, the lessons of history are that the world's most powerful military is usually the invitation for everybody else who are not the world's most powerful military to gang up on it. You know, that's been the lesson of history.
It's like the playground bully.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other kids get even.
At some point, the other kids are just, you know, we've had enough. We're going to take you out back and, you know, pound a little sense into you.
Yeah.
I go back to Venice, folks. At a certain point in European history, basically everybody had just had it.
Yeah. And didn't the Venetians come from the Phoenicians?
Pardon me. Well, I talk about that in Babylon's Banksters, and again a little bit in the sequel that's coming out. You can make a general case that they do, and I want to stress general. Mm-hmm. All right? We don't know what some of those families, like the Della Torre, which is the Italian version of Fontorno and Taxis, all right?
Yeah.
Or the d'Este family. We don't know what some of those Italian noble families preserve in terms of their familial history. They're not talking. Now, in Venice, there was a book called Libro d'Oro, the Golden Book, and it was kind of an official state-sponsored census of everybody who was nobility. And it was used to make sure that you were entitled to a seat in the Grand Council and so on and so forth.
Oh.
So in other words, it was kind of an official state history or archive of who was noble and who wasn't.
Yeah.
You had the Longhi, which were the Venetian nobility that claimed a long heritage, a long history.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had what were called the Curti, which were kind of like the nouveau riche.
Yeah.
Okay. So we don't really know what those families might preserve in terms of their private family histories. So the best we can say is that there is a relationship historically between the flight of the old Roman noble and bureaucratic families northward into the northern part of the Italian peninsula during the barbarian invasions. And then you turn the clock back and you realize that those families at the time of the collapse of the empire were really not the native Italian or Latin stock at all, because that stock had long since moved out of the peninsula, and the people that were there in the late empire were largely from Chaldea, which was the Roman way of saying Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
So there is that kind of general connection. You can read the Roman satirist Juvenal complaining about it. He claimed that the river Orontes, or the Euphrates, flowed into the Tiber.
Mm-hmm.
And what he meant by that was that if you looked around at then Imperial Rome and looked at the bureaucrats and everybody that was running the show, it was no longer the native Latin Roman population. It was all these imported slaves that, according to the Roman practice, had been freed on the master's death, and made their way into the imperial bureaucracy.
Oh.
So, the late Roman Empire looks Babylonian.
Yeah. Well, while you mentioned Rome, what are your thoughts on this new pope?
Oh, boy. I knew you were going to sneak that one in at some point.
I didn't mean to light the piece of dynamite. I really didn't.
Oh, brother. Well, I've got to be perfectly honest. I know what my thoughts are, but my emotions are different. My emotions, I want to cut this guy, the benefit of a doubt.
Yeah.
He certainly, in his first words, appeared to be a decent, kind of humble, soft-spoken, plain sort of, plain sort of fellow. So that's my emotional reaction. I certainly don't wish any world leader that takes up a position like that any ill, because in my opinion you have to be kind of nuts to accept a position like that in the first place. So, you have my prayers, Francis. Godspeed and everything. I wish you all the best, and I certainly wouldn't do it. You couldn't pay me enough. But anyway, that's the emotional part.
Okay.
The intellectual part of me, first of all, just doesn't and never has accepted the idea of the papacy.
Right.
Because, first of all, being from the Eastern Orthodox tradition, it's just anathema to me. It's no part of the original deposit of the Catholic faith. That has been the Orthodox position all along.
Yes.
And eventually, the Orthodox Church excommunicated the Western Church because of the papacy's insistence that it alone was in charge of everything.
Yeah.
Well, that's just BS.
Yeah.
Much less claiming to be infallible. That's another little problem. So I have that problem. In other words, my intellectual part just says even from the Christian point of view, there's too many theological problems with the whole idea of the institution of the papacy.
Yeah.
It's a false office.
Yes.
And therefore, it's, in a certain sense, it's a cult.
Yes, yes it
and
is.
What disturbs me is that you have the Western media at the time, all of these supposed secularists, many of whom the journalists reporting on it don't even really have any religious affiliations, and yet they use the phrase, the church, when talking about all this. Well, say those words in Moscow.
Oh, boy.
Because, as far as the Orthodox Church is concerned, the Roman Catholic Church isn't the church.
Yeah.
It's the Orthodox Church that's the church.
Mm-hmm.
And as far, you can go back and find Russian intellectuals in the 19th century that will tell you the Pope is the first Protestant. Because as far as the Orthodox are concerned, they're the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
So, and I would agree with that view on historical grounds alone.
Uh-huh.
In other words, I think you can argue a simply historical case. But what gripes me is you have the so-called secular media of the West pushing the idea that this is the church and this election is something we ought to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, certainly we ought to pay attention to it because this is the world's largest Christian body. And whoever is the Pope is the head of it. So, yeah, we ought to pay attention to it on those grounds alone.
Yeah.
But not because it's the church. Follow me?
Right.
Now, with that in mind, let's look at Francis.
Okay.
This is where things get a little murky as far as I'm concerned. We just got done having a German Pope, and now, golly, we've got an Argentinian Pope.
Yeah.
Now, just from the historical point of view, I view this with a little bit of jaundiced suspicion. Okay?
Yeah.
And I think you know what I'm getting at here.
Yeah.
When the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires becomes Pope after a German becomes Pope, methinks we ought to at least be entertaining that there might be the faint odor of suspicion here.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the other problem here is that he's a Jesuit.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I'm not going to even go where most of you are already headed with Black Pope, and he's really secretly the guy, that really runs things in the Vatican and not the guy out front on the balcony.
Right.
I'm not even going there, folks. Vatican conspiracies are a dime a dozen, and I'm not going there. I am, however, going to say that, yes, the Jesuit order is very powerful, and yes, its history has been known to be a history of seeking political influence.
Yes.
And more importantly, what people don't know is that it was the Jesuit order that in the 19th century was the order that was most conspicuous in pushing for the definition of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council in 1870.
Yeah.
So that makes me suspicious. And then when the Jesuit decides he's going to take the name of Francis, the first pope in history. Now, let's look at the name. That could either be Francis of Assisi, which we have now been told that's who he had in mind, or it could be Francis Xavier, a Jesuit saint in the Roman Church, who was, in a certain sense, kind of a militant fellow, all right?
Yeah.
All right? So we've got the choice of a name that could be interpreted in two very different ways as a symbol. And notably, this Pope didn't choose any name that could be remotely construed. I don't care what certain individuals in the American evangelical community are saying about Petrus Romanus and the prophecies of Malachi and all of that.
Yeah.
You know, what they're doing is backpedaling, folks. It's like Hal Lindsey, who predicted the rapture was going to occur in the 1990s and then had to backpedal when it didn't happen.
Yeah.
This is exactly what these people are doing. So quit buying their books.
That's right. You're right.
Francis is sending a dubious signal, an ambiguous signal with the choice of the name Francis.
Yeah.
He could either be communicating the intention that he's a caretaker pope, and you have to raise and entertain that suspicion, GeorgeAnn, because he's not in the best of health.
Right.
Or he could be communicating his intention to clean house, to be a truly militant pope.
Yeah.
We don't know at this stage what this man is capable of. A lot will depend very closely on watching to see how he arranges the internal governance of the Vatican city-state itself. In other words, who is he going to put in charge of the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith? Who's he going to put in charge of missions and evangelism? Is he going to leave these people that are already there in place? What is he going to do? And more importantly, watch who he names as cardinals.
Yes.
Because it's the cardinals who will elect the next pope.
Yeah.
So you'll see the direction that he wants the church to go in by who he names as cardinals.
Yeah.
Now, I do think it's very significant that he's from Latin America.
Yes.
Because this is a clear indicator that, number one, the cardinals who elected him realize that we can no longer rely on the European center of the church. That its center of gravity is elsewhere. But they also realize we dare not go directly to the third world. That would be seen as too much of a challenge by the Chinese.
Yeah.
It would be seen as too much of a challenge by the Muslims.
Yes.
So we need to go to another heartland of Catholicism, and one that will give us a bridge to the third world and maintain our cultural connection to Europe, and that's Latin America. So from that point of view, his election is very, very sensible. It's very sensible. Now, it has emerged since his election that there was some scandal involving him and two Jesuit priests that were rounded up by the Medellin, or I forget what the Argentinian president's name, the military junta that ruled Argentina.
Yeah.
Back in the 70s, and that led to Galtieri and that whole Falklands mess.
Yeah.
It's rumored that he had something to do with the arrest of a couple Jesuit priests that spent some time in the tender attentions of the Argentinian intelligence services, and that he had kind of caused that by removing his protection from these priests. In other words, by saying that, well, the church is not going to back you up if you end up in prison. It's also emerged that apparently after these two Jesuit priests were arrested and, suffered God knows what at the hands of Argentine intelligence services, that Francis did go to the dictator's home, celebrated a private mass, and persuaded him to release these two priests. So we don't really know what this man's role in that period of Argentine history is. He's refused to comment on it. To me, that raises red flags.
Yeah.
Because if he had a kind of connection with that junta to the point that he could, go celebrate a private mass,
yeah,
that, to me, indicates he may have some very, very deep ties to that kind of Latin American fascist sort of culture and group, and we know what's behind that.
Yeah.
And that's the part of me that is very suspicious. All of this goes back to Benedict XVI's resignation, and I'm convinced that this is probably a resignation that was done under duress, and that the election of Francis may be a subtle response of some kind by the cardinalate to that threat. Time will tell. And by threat, I don't simply mean the pedophile scandal. I also mean the financial, right?
Well,
which I think is probably the greater of the two, in terms of how Vatican power politics will play out.
Oh, gee, Joseph.
Yeah.
It's huge.
Well, of course it's huge.
Oh.
This is, it's the financial aspect of it that bothers me the most, and this is why I think it's very significant that they went with the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires.
Yeah.
Again, Buenos Aires is one of those Latin American cities with very powerful banking connections to Europe and London and New York. So it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out.
Boy, you're not kidding. It's, there's all this celebratory stuff going on about the new Pope this, the new Pope that.
Both that, yeah. Well, I'm not, you don't see me waving the pom-poms.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've heard that the previous Pope is staying in the Vatican to avoid being arrested.
I've heard that too. And I've heard two different versions of that Benedict has decided to live kind of a hermetic monastic life. They're trying to spin this as spirituality. And anytime, from my own experience in religion and organized religion, anytime they start talking about spirituality publicly, usually there's a deeply hidden political reason that has nothing to do, pardon me, with what they're saying publicly. Pardon me. I've heard two versions of Benedict and his self-imposed exile. The first is that he was indicted by some international common law court for crimes against humanity. Well, number one, I don't know how any international common law court, even if it did have legitimate jurisdiction, could even enforce anything.
They can't.
They can't because, international common law, come on. Most of Europe isn't under common law. That's problem number one.
Right.
So, that's what makes me suspicious. But there was a second version of the story that said that the Italian state prosecutor was getting ready to indict and arrest Benedict if he set foot outside the Vatican. Now, that would be a very different thing.
Yes.
Because the problem there is that Benedict, as the head of state of the Vatican, has diplomatic immunity. You can't arrest a head of state.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And, if the Italian state prosecutor had done that, then that would have effectively meant that Italy was saying we're revoking our recognition of Vatican sovereignty.
Yes.
So, again, I'm skeptical of the story for that reason. But it could be that in some nuance of Italian law, they were thinking that the papal office is precisely that. It's an office. And if you resign the office, you're no longer the head of state.
Right.
And therefore, you're no longer subject to the same immunities. So it could be that was in the back of their mind. I simply don't know enough about this story, and I haven't, as yet, GeorgeAnn, I haven't seen anybody follow up on these niceties of law and what they might mean for the legitimacy of the story. So, right now I'm keeping it in a 50-50 basket. It might be true, it might not be.
Yeah.
If there's somebody out there listening to this in Italy that knows more about what was being talked about over there, or knows some nuances of Italian law and things like that, that would be interesting to hear. But over here, GeorgeAnn, I haven't seen anybody start asking these types of questions.
Well, all of Europe, Greece, Spain, Portugal, even Belgium,
right?
France, Germany, they're all protesting. They're all, I think,
protesting what?
Well, no jobs.
Well, yeah.
You know, no jobs, no money, people being thrown out of their homes. It's just sick, Joseph, the whole thing, and in our country too.
Yeah.
It's gut-wrenching to watch what's going on here.
The thing that people have to be very cautious about right now is allowing legitimate protest to be co-opted by radical movements of the left or right, or as was an attempt during the Occupy Wall Street thing over here. If you study that long enough, you'll find the dark, murky, as far as I'm concerned, slimy hand of George Soros.
Yeah.
And, you know, he's got some murky connections to the National Endowment for Democracy, which is, as far as I'm concerned, just kind of a revolutionary CIA front. You know, that's what's been behind the so-called color revolutions in Eastern Europe. So, you know, you have to be very skeptical of these movements being co-opted, because they're so easy to turn into or to manipulate for political purposes that are all part of the elitist agenda. That's what's so very difficult about all this right now.
What do you think is going to be the end game in the United States for the people?
Well, I don't think that we're in an end game phase.
Okay.
This is why I think people need to be very cautious. You know me, I'm not an apocalypticist.
You're right.
I think a lot of people want it, or are subconsciously approaching this phase as if it were an end, or the end.
Yeah.
I don't think so. This is why I keep saying we are in the biggest period of cultural transition in human history.
You're right.
Right now.
You're right.
And to a certain extent, it's very easy to allow others to play apocalyptic fear-mongering games in that situation.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, I think the elites are driving much of that. You know, that's why Dr. DeHart and I called that little Yahweh the Two-Faced God book Apocalypse Theater, Volume 1. Because it's all too easy for the elites to create versions of apocalyptic expectation and then use those versions to further their agenda in staged fulfillments.
Yeah.
This is why I absolutely run like crazy when I see evangelical Christians approaching with their latest version of the apocalypse. Whether it be long drawn out spins of why Francis I really is the last pope, and you know, I have no time for these people. Yeah, I just delete those emails. They're not getting it. You know, they're just not getting it. Well, this is an end in the sense that something new is beginning, and none of us know really what it is. Yeah. You can forget your Yahwist religions. You know, they're all looking at this as the end and the final vindication of their truth claims. Well, gee. That doesn't bode too well. Yeah. for the rest of the world, you know. You just can't face anything. Hold on, Joseph. Yeah, I hear.
Okay, folks, we're back, and we can't remember what we were talking about because the alarm went off. and
4 alarms.
Yeah, 4 alarms is right. Oh, my gosh. Oh, Joseph, I think we were talking about the Vatican.
Yeah, but I don't remember what context.
Yeah.
I'm at a loss, so my apologies to everybody. But
oh, well, and the apocalyptic issues and...
Well, I don't remember what I was saying. I'm sorry.
I know. Well, Joseph, this... What is going to happen to the people in the United States via all the secret technology that they've got?
Well, that's another good question. I mean, in fact, that would be a whole other show.
We can do that.
I really, I really don't know what to say. I remain, I'm not saying this as an antidote for anybody else, but for my part, I have never viewed the Democratic Party as a moral option for me, and I've gone into this before.
Yes. Because
to me, seeing that party name on a ballot is like seeing National Socialist German Workers' Party.
Yeah.
In other words, this is a party that supported slavery, and I just find that whole institution, the idea, morally abhorrent.
Yes.
It would be like pulling the lever for Nazi,
Yeah.
And I don't care. They can say, "Oh, we've changed our spots. We're not that way. That was a long time ago." Well, would you buy that from a Nazi?
No.
I really see that party as a party of slavery in one form or another. It may be disguised slavery by giving people government programs and what have you, but there's always a price, and it's always your freedom. And
the slim-minded use of the word Republican, too many people equate that with the Republic.
Well, that's the other problem. The other party isn't a genuine opposition party, and it's every bit as corrupt as the Democrats. So I don't see any real political option in this country. There's a bunch of third parties, but until you break the monopoly of these two oligarchical parties and the vested interests that they represent, nothing's going to change.
Right.
You see at a state level some attempt being done to circumvent the federal level.
Yeah.
And it's coming from both political parties. But I think the sooner there is a real viable third-party alternative, or to put it much more accurately, a real second party, the better.
Yeah.
And one that, genuinely represents the people. The problem in this country is there's too much money in elections, and it's been a problem for a long time. That basically means that you can't get elected without big corporate donors. So, system-wise, I don't see much benefit. I think the real problem, however, is a much deeper cultural thing.
Oh, yes.
And that it has to be addressed at that level.
Mm-hmm.
The United States is a badly polarized country.
Oh, yes, it is.
Right now, it is. It's badly polarized.
Yes. And
I don't see that changing anytime soon, unfortunately. I really don't.
Oh, boy.
And the reason I don't see it changing anytime soon is again, these two political parties have a lock, and there's, already we're hearing talk of Mike Huckabee and Jeb Bush.
Oh, my God.
Well, Now, come on, Republithugs, wake up here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Bush family is, I don't care what you say about it, it's a notoriously corrupt family.
Yes. The
family history is very corrupt, and I'm not talking just Nazis here. I'm talking savings and loan scandal. I'm talking April Gillespie and Iraq invading Kuwait, and you know, all of this.
Mm-hmm.
It is a notoriously corrupt family.
Yeah.
If you trust that family, you know, go ahead, vote for Jeb, but I don't, and I never will.
No.
I believe that they represent that, you know.
Well, they're trying to keep it in the dynasty.
Well, they're trying to keep it in the dynasty, and they represent that same oligarchy, in effect.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a vote for Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and then, you know, Mike Huckabee, well, I'm sorry, you know.
Oh, what a joke.
If you want to keep wedding yourself to right-wing American evangelicalism and fundamentalism, fine, go ahead. But I'm sorry, you know, most of the country is not headed in that direction.
Yeah.
So, it's just nuts. I mean, you look at the Republican Party and see these yokels that they're already talking about running.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. You don't get my vote.
Amen. Oh, boy. Oh, Joseph. I have heard, and I don't know if there's any truth to it, but that Hillary Clinton is under military house arrest.
Well, I've heard, you know, I saw that. I had a bunch of people email me that, but come on, folks. If that were true, it would be too big a secret even to keep off the mainstream media.
Mm-hmm.
No. Pardon me. You know, that's just another one of those crazy internet stories that whoever comes up with these things likes to put out. I place no credence in that whatsoever.
Okay. Well, Joseph, we've got NDAA.
Yes.
And I don't find a lot of difference in the we will lock you up forever type rules with no contact with anybody, no charges. I don't find a lot of difference in that and what goes on at Gitmo.
There isn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
There isn't.
Yeah, and
there's no difference between that and some of the things the British were trying to do prior to the American Revolution, and for that matter, there's no difference between that and what Abraham Lincoln was doing.
Yeah. During
the American Civil War. You know, none, zero, zilch. It's an abomination, and I use that pun deliberetely.
Yes.
But, you know, it's not, again, folks, it's not just the dummy crooks that are behind this. It's the Republithugs as well. They're both up to their earlobes with this so-called war on terror and all of these curtailments of civil liberties and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Again, you know, if there were a genuine philosophical alternative to these two political parties, watch what would happen in this country. They would be out of power so fast it would make people's heads spin.
Oh.
And that ought to tell you something right there.
Yes.
You know, do an experiment. Try and listen for, you know, if you can stomach it, try and listen for a day to American talk radio. All right? Now, I defy anybody who does to find a genuine, well-argued, liberal talk show host on American talk radio. And for that matter, I defy you to find any really well-articulated, genuine kind of centrist or even libertarian position on American talk radio. You've got the flag-waving patriots who like to, you know, call each other, "You're a great American" all the time. I'm thinking of one particular talk show host in particular, that this is on his lips every other call.
Oh gosh.
Well, if everybody's a great American, who are the average ones?
Yeah.
You know?
Me.
Yeah, exactly. We've become a culture of hyperbole, that we've lost our sense of vertical value, our hierarchy of value, and it's all too apparent in all of these talk shows. This is why you have no intellectual equivalence anymore on the American political scene, as far as I'm concerned, to, let's say, a John Kenneth Galbraith for the political left, or a Gore Vidal for the political left, or a William F. Buckley for the political right. You don't have people of that stature anymore.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, our political discourse is suffering, and as a consequence of that, at a deeper level, it's because our cultural discourse, there isn't any. If we live in a country that actually you can find people that will refer to, I've heard this, in conversation, examples of this, that will in one sentence refer to J.S. Bach and the Beatles.
Oh dear.
And Ice-T.
Oh brother.
As artists.
Yeah, right.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. J.S. Bach is utterly out of the league of the other two. Absolutely. Utterly. There's no hierarchy of value anymore.
Right.
Great art is not about self-expression.
Oh.
It's about more than that. So, to me, great art is the creative use of tradition. But for many of these people, it's just merely self-expression, no matter how bad it is.
Yeah.
And you have to drive down the street with your bad taste blaring away so that it imposes itself on everybody else.
Yeah.
America is a barbarous nation.
Yes, we are barbaric with our Gitmo and 100 other establishments around the world where we torture people, pick them up on the whim of it's that guy, and then torture the hell out of them, and then turn them loose. No charges, no nothing. And Joseph, I don't think people realize.
No, they don't.
How hideous that is. How
they don't. But this is always the mechanism of tyranny. It always has to have both an external and an internal enemy to thrive.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter how contrived the internal enemy is.
Yes.
Or, for that matter, the external one. And, as far as I'm concerned, tyranny is always the last refuge of a culture or civilization or nation in decline.
Yeah.
And, it never works. It just, the bottom line is it never, ever works.
Amen. Well, I'm wondering if we're going to go into a full revolution in this country, or if the people are just going to, oh-ho-hum, and business as usual until...
No, I don't think either.
Okay.
I don't think either. I don't think either. And part of that is because at some deep level, many people do sense this as a period of cultural transition, and therefore previously tried methods or solutions may not work. I really think that there is a long-term trend going on, and it's between the informed, the elite, and the uninformed. I think basically you have those kinds of responses to what's going on. And that means it is transcending traditional cultural divisions to a certain extent. I'm not saying that there are no more cultural distinctions. I mean, certainly if you live in an Islamic country, it's going to be a very different culture than living in China or living in, Russia or what have you. But within each culture, you have three different types of individual, and I think the responses to whatever this is that the whole world is going through are essentially being made by uninformed people. And in America, we call them dummy crooks and republicthugs that continue to vote for one of these two political parties and expect things to change.
Yeah.
Well,
that
to me, that's insanity. Precisely. Precisely. You want to vote for a political party that backed Enron and expect things to change.
Oh, gee.
Or for the current president, one of whose major backers is George Soros.
Yeah.
And you think you're getting the party of the people?
Oh, gee.
Wake up. Wake up. There is a growing number of people I know in this country that don't vote, and for them, that is precisely an exercise of their vote.
Yeah, that me included.
Me, it would be me. It would be several people I know
Mm-hmm.
that are fed up.
Oh, yeah.
and realize that, they've been throwing their vote away with these two political parties. Now, that's a dangerous situation.
Yes.
Because there was a similar deadlock in Weimar Germany.
Uh-huh.
And all it takes to fill is a fast-talking demagogue.
Yes.
Now, they made a good attempt at that with the current occupant of the White House. But he's not flashy enough.
Yeah. He's not believable.
And no, he's no longer believable. I never did believe him.
Me neither.
But many people did.
Huh.
But there is a vacuum in this country. And it would be all too easy for the elite to put up another pretender in this circumstance. That's what I'm really more afraid of than anything else. The elite, the oligarchy, is basically fascist by culture and mentality. And quite a lot of them are just plain good old-fashioned Nazis in that they think that somehow they're racially superior to everybody else. What bothers me is that in this kind of vacuum situation, they have, in the past, tended to turn to these types of solutions. A desperate population fed up with the go-nowhere deadlock of, the current mediocrities in politics, and then bang, you get an Adolf Hitler or a Vladimir Lenin or, people that are very astute at manipulating their cultural symbols and thereby the people.
Yeah.
That's what bothers me the most. And with the kind of non-critical flag waving that goes on in this country right now, particularly in the elites of both parties. You've got this non-critical flag waving, support the troops, thank you for your service, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, my heart goes out to those soldiers and their families that come back from these wars maimed or
mentally destroyed.
Or, whatever. My heart goes out to these people. But there is a difference between supporting in that sense and this blind support your troops, give them more money, get the mission done. And there is no critical examination of the mission.
Exactly.
What profoundly disturbs me is even with the Internet, GeorgeAnn, we have no equivalent to the 1960s anti-war movement in this country. That was a war that was being fought needlessly, in my opinion. Some currently may disagree. But we both know that there was a real long, serious, prolonged, open debate about that war in this country that occurred because of that.
Yeah.
We have no equivalent, and there needs to be one.
Yes.
There needs to be one. Are we really in Afghanistan to halt the spread of radical Islam, or are we really there to build a pipeline and protect the opium trade?
The latter. And I'll tell you something, Joseph, with all these damn drone strikes, we are creating enemies faster.
Of course we are.
Oh my God.
Of course. Well, I go back to what I said earlier in this interview about Japan. We've had a base on Okinawa in Japan that has been a thorn in the side of the Japanese population on that island for that entire time because of all the rapes that occurred.
Yes.
Well, you can't blame them.
Right.
You know, there's only so long we can go around putting in bases on other people's territory without them demanding something in return. Well, you know, the Germans.
Yeah.
They finally got fed up with so many bases in their country, they demanded one over here.
Yeah.
You know? Now we've got the Luftwaffe flying around the southwestern United States. You know, that makes me feel much safer. You know?
Oh boy!
to have this service arm that Herman Goering invented, protecting American airspace. You know?
Oh Lord!
So you know, this is nuts. It's just nuts. You're right. We're creating enemies faster than we make friends, and you know. We better wake up.
We're not interested in making friends, apparently.
No, it doesn't seem that way.
We are more interested in global dominance.
Well, the only friend we're interested in maintaining good relationships with, at least right now, are Israel and the United Kingdom. But I can't see that we're all that concerned about anybody else.
Yeah.
Which, you know, it used to be the case we could go abroad and we might be kind of snickered at or tolerated, you know, the ugly, stupid American. But now, I wouldn't want to go overseas to certain countries.
No, they cut your head
off. And I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia either.
Yeah. Yeah. They'd cut your head off.
Well, it's not good.
Mm-mm.
I just hope most of the world understands that it's not the American people
right
that are behind all of this. It's the American oligarchy.
Yes.
And
most of these countries have their own oligarchies.
Have their own, of course they do.
To deal with, and they're beginning to understand that.
Well, look. What we really have, it's very important for people to understand. The international locus of military power isn't the UN, it's NATO.
Yes.
In the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were people that said, well, you know, the purpose of NATO has been served, it needs to dissolve. The Russians pointed that out. Well, what are you keeping it together for?
Yeah.
Well, it was clear what they kept it together for. It's become the arm, the international military arm of the Western oligarchy.
Oh, God.
So, you know, it's as much a French, Spanish, Italian, German, British, Canadian, Australian thing as it is American.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're all in this together now. So it's, you know, I think the other signature of this cultural transition is it's going to be a global transition in many ways that's going to be accomplished by each national opposition to this oligarchy.
Uh-huh.
I really think that that's part of what is freaking the elites out.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see the opposition playing out?
Well, in some cases it'll be absolute open protest.
Yeah. Because
there's no other way to get it accomplished.
Yeah.
In some cases, it's going to be a combination of that and quiet backing from a non-Western great power. I really do think that. We need to remember something in the United States, very important, that during the American Civil War, you had very quiet geopolitical goings-on in the background.
Yes.
You had France and Britain threatening to come into the war on the side of the Confederacy. And what most Americans don't realize is that what may have kept them out of that war was the fact that the Tsar sent the Russian fleet to the United States in 1863.
Yeah.
As a way of, Russia was doing, at the same time, was in the middle of a huge social experiment in the emancipation of the serfs in Russia.
Yeah.
And the Tsar had really done it the right way, because what the Russian government did was it created very low interest loans to the serfs so that they could buy their land and then farm it. And then, of course, the Russian government took out bonds and so on and so forth to pay for all this. But in other words, they gave the serfs a stake in the Russian economy.
Yes.
Well, this was not done over here with the slaves. But at least you had a kind of similar sociological phenomenon being entertained in America as a result of the Civil War as was going on in Russia. So Russia, in other words, was threatening to step in on the side of the Union. So, the Civil War might have gone global.
Yeah.
So we have to understand that in this country, and certainly our elite does understand this. This is why, to another level, the game is really being played very delicately right now. Because if there were a similar situation of social breakdown in this country, you can bet your bottom dollar that the great powers of Europe and the rest of the world would have their fingers in the pie.
Oh. Well,
this is why I don't want, for all of these right-wing or left-wing radical nutcases out there that think, we're going to go march on the Pentagon and chase Manhattan and throw all these people into jail.
Well, they need to go to jail.
Well, I'm not saying they don't need to go to jail, but what I'm saying is these radical nutcases that are talking revolution and all this stuff.
Yeah.
The other thing you better really understand is if that happens, and I hope it doesn't, for all you would-be revolutionaries and anarchists out there, if that happens, rest assured, Russia, China, probably some of the European powers are going to have their fingers in the pie.
You mean in defense?
No, they're going to be quietly backing, financially and in other ways, just like the American Civil War. This is what I'm trying to tell you. And you don't think some of the Latin American countries would?
Oh, absolutely.
You don't think some of the drug cartels would?
Oh, yeah.
You see, this is why I say, I don't think the elites are going to be too quick to throw the war dice.
Yeah.
Those dice can come up any which way. They cannot fix the game.
Right.
So, if there is that kind of situation, God forbid, then expect. It's just a matter of geopolitics, folks. It's just a matter of the realities of the situation. You can bet your bottom dollar that you're going to find Russia, China, probably Germany or France, one of the European powers that would like nothing better than for this country to collapse and fall apart.
Oh, yeah.
Trust me here.
Well, you've read it too, Joseph, where China's going to come over here and collect on their hard assets. They're going to be marching in the streets, kicking people out of their homes. Yeah. I don't believe that.
Well, number one, it doesn't do the Chinese any good.
Right.
That's not what I'm talking about here. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking, to all these nutcases that think they're going to take up a pistol and initiate the Great Revolution and throw all these monsters out of power.
Yeah.
That's nuts. Because if you do that, you're playing right into the geopolitical hands of those countries with long histories that would like nothing better, regardless of what they say about being our friends now, than for this country to fall apart.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. That's just, and don't think for a moment that our oligarchy doesn't know that. Yeah. They do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, the sequester thing, it's on a par with austerity.
Yes and no. It's not a genuine cut. It's not a genuine cut. The problem with this whole thing is it's theater.
Yeah.
The real financial problems aren't with the nuts in Washington, in the Senate, who can't come up with a budget, or in the House, who can't see the light and quit funding worthless, economically breaking social programs like Obromniak.
Yeah.
And I'm tired of hearing the Republicans blame the dummy crooks for that, when it was a conservative Republican think tank called the Heritage Foundation that came up with some of the provisions in Obromniak care.
Oh, brother.
You know, the sooner the people in this country wake up to the fact that these two political parties are not about them, they're about corporations and their cronies, the better we'll be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, Joseph. Well, it's a rocky road that we're on right now.
It's a rocky road. And, you know, the real deep problem here that people have to get through their heads is this isn't a kind of warfare that's about revolutions or guns or any of that crap. It's an epistemological warfare. I love that phrase. Webster Tarpley uses it all the time, and I think he's spot on.
Yes.
Because it's really a warfare about your basic, fundamental, philosophical worldview and how you know or think you know. It's interesting to me. It's extremely interesting to me that he has put his finger on something that I have thought, and Dr. DeHart has thought, and many of our friends have thought for a long time, that there is a basically Hermetic or Platonic view of the world, and there's a basically materialistic or Aristotelian one.
Yeah.
And most of our elites, be they banksters or scientists or sociologists or neurophysiologists or what have you, are fundamentally in the Aristotelian camp. And interestingly enough, most of the leading luminous lights in the history of science, particularly in the West, have been in the other camp.
Oh boy.
So, you know, to me it's about the long-term cultural aspects. What do you ground your system, your outlook in? This is why I keep writing so much about that topological metaphor in so many of my books.
Yes.
Because it's an essentially Hermetic or Platonic or, if you will, immaterial or spiritual or what have you. It's in that tradition. And once you see the full implications of that tradition, yeah, you might always be in a minority, but you're going to be in a very influential one.
Well, look at the generation that's coming up and the one that has just come up with the problems with education. No critical thinking.
Well, yeah, look at B.O.
Yeah. And closing...
Or for that matter, George W.
Yeah, exactly. And the closing of hundreds of schools.
Yeah. Well, look, why keep pumping money into an educational system that doesn't work?
Exactly.
And, you know, I lay most of the blame squarely on the party of the political left in this country for that, and then on the other party for not standing in any sort of real opposition, philosophically, to what was going on. This is the problem. And again, you can see in basic education a broadly Aristotelian versus a broadly Platonic approach at work there. Scientific standardization, rationalization, materialism, and everybody being made to fit one mold versus an idea that education is something spiritual and a recollection and that everybody is individual and unique.
Yes.
Again, it's the same sort of basic philosophical difference.
Oh, Joseph.
People have to get back to some deep analysis.
Yes.
Well,
I find that a good 75% of the people have trouble connecting the dots.
Well, they can't connect dots because they're not taught to anymore in our school system.
That's what I was...
Again, let's take an example of a question that might appear in an American standardized history test for college, all right?
Okay.
The question might read, who killed John F. Kennedy?
Yeah.
And the answer would be, A, Jack Ruby, B, Lee Harvey Oswald, C, J. Edgar Hoover, D, none of the above. Something superficial and silly.
Yes.
Like that.
Yeah.
And immediately what the question doesn't allow you to do is think critically and challenge the official story.
Right.
That's what it won't allow you to do.
Right.
But imagine asking the question as an essay question where you actually have to sit down and write out your answer and your thought.
Absolutely.
You see the difference.
Oh, yes.
The difference being that somebody might defend the official version and do so brilliantly.
Mm.
The difference being that someone might oppose the official version and do so brilliantly.
Yeah.
The difference being that someone might present both versions and do so brilliantly and then say, this is why I'm coming down on this side, which would be the best kind of answer.
Yeah.
But the American system is not designed to do that. It's actually designed to get you not to do that as a matter of habit.
To spoon feed you.
To spoon feed you pre-selected answers so that you will think this is the answer and do no further search on your own.
Right.
This isn't education.
You're right.
It's indoctrination into a cult.
Yeah. Yeah. There's all kinds of cults. People think that when you talk about the occult, you're talking about medieval pointy hats and Ouija boards and stuff.
No. It can be the cult of 9/11.
Yes.
That we have to defend ourselves against all these billions of Muslims that are out to destroy our way of life.
Oh, gee. They had to come up with a new boogeyman,
Oh,
God.
Now, I get my tobacco from a little Arab man that owns a shop around the corner that's a Muslim,
Yeah.
I don't feel particularly threatened by him.
Right.
It's just kind of nuts. It's just kind of nuts. So I don't know. Do we qualify those kinds of associations now as suspect? Well, in a former age, we might have qualified having Roman Catholic friends as suspect.
Yeah.
Or for that matter, as having atheistic friends as suspect. They might be communist agents, It's nuts.
Yes, you're right, Joseph.
It's a psychosis that I just can't live life with.
Well, with what we did to Iraq, I'm sorry, but the people that knew in advance that this whole thing was based on a lie should be shot.
I don't know that they should be shot, but they should at least stand trial.
Oh, my God.
They should at least stand trial.
Publicly.
Well, there is such a thing as fraud and inducement to fraud and misprision and all of these things that, are coming to light now, and yet these people are waltzing around scot-free. They're under no scrutiny other than from a certain segment of the alternative media.
Yeah.
But they're certainly not under any scrutiny from either of the two major political parties. And again, the reason why is that both elites of both political parties were complicit.
Yes.
And,
absolutely.
This is why we, again, have to take a long view.
Yes.
Culturally. There are always going to be people in this country who think any sort of dot connecting is conspiracy theory. No, it's not. It's critical thinking.
Yes.
And it's interesting to find that it was largely out of the American Historical Society that you had this notion pushed that history was largely a matter of forces, economics, mass aggregates of statistics, and never was the idea of conspiracy to be broached as a serious historiographical subject of inquiry.
Yeah.
Well, the facts say otherwise.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But, what would we expect from a society that gets a lot of funding from major family foundations?
Yeah.
So the sooner Americans wake up and adopt the view that if a politician is on television and his mouth is open, your first thought should be he's lying.
Yeah.
So where is the lie?
Yeah.
And if investigating you find, he's telling the truth, then more power to him.
Oh. Well, Joseph, a parting statement. RT is running a special on Iraq.
Yes.
And one of the Iraqi men was so upset and just yelling and tearful that the women go to the hospital to have a baby and they throw the baby away because it's a monster born from the DU and the other weaponry. And France, it's alleged, is also using DU in Mali.
Well, unfortunately, depleted uranium has been a favorite weapon for, armor-piercing weapon for Western military forces for a while. There's even, I've run across every now and then little suggestions that even during World War II the Germans may have been using some of it. But I've never found enough corroboration to, ever come out and write anything about it. But, it's been around for a long time. It doesn't surprise me. I really don't think that we're going to know, maybe even in our lifetime, the real story about Iraq until there's enough research being done by non-Western sources.
Right.
And independent journalists and so on, and putting all of it together.
And another issue is the Hanford plant up in...
up in Washington.
Yes. Tank after tank after tank is spilling highly radioactive stuff.
Well, look, this is the other problem. Nuclear fission technologies, I'm sorry, and I don't want to come across sounding like some sort of Luddite here.
Yeah.
But, I'm hardly against technological innovation or advancement, but nuclear fission is by the nature of the case, a technology that is just an extraordinarily bad idea.
It's antique.
Well, I agree with you. I happen to think it's probably an antique too. That there's a lot that they have hidden and that they're keeping hidden for various reasons. And I am writing a sequel to Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations right now, and I think I've come across what one of the major reasons why they're keeping a lot of this stuff secret is, and I don't want to go into it right now.
Oh, gee.
But I think that there's a reason that nobody has really looked at.
Yeah.
And again, I go back to what I've said many times in our Cosmic War series when we first started doing these interviews. The elite has known about these technologies or their potentials for a very long time.
Yes.
And in a certain sense, they've had to suppress them because, as I've said before, if you weaponize the stuff, you've got something that has the potential to make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker.
Yeah. Now,
what I want people to do is go online and Google Tsar Bomba. That's T-S-A-R, like the Russian word for Tsar. And then Bomba, B-O-M-B-A.
Okay.
All right? That was the largest hydrogen bomb that was ever detonated in history.
Oh, my God.
The Russians detonated this monster. It was an enormous 57 megatons. I mean, the biggest one we ever detonated was 15. So, in other words, the Russians blew up a bomb with greater explosive force than Tunguska.
Oh, boy.
Okay.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, this was. Now, I want you to look at that bomb and read all the statistics about it, how far away people could see the flash and feel the window panes shaking and so on and so forth. And then remember what I just said. If you weaponize this stuff, you have something that makes a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker.
Oh, God.
And the other problem is conceivably it's easier to engineer than a hydrogen bomb. A hydrogen bomb is a pretty complex piece of machining that requires extreme precision.
Yeah.
In building. I mean, you have no idea. So, do the elites have a proliferation problem potentially on their hands? Well, you betcha. Would you want a Joseph Stalin getting their hands on this, or an Ayatollah Khomeini, or Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, or a Bibi Netanyahu?
I'd be more afraid of Yahoo than...
Well, frankly, I'm afraid of all of them. Because they're all just kind of kooky. Would you want them with their hands on this stuff? Well, the answer is no.
Right.
So they had a proliferation problem, long before they had an A-bomb problem, in my opinion. So, yeah. But as events went along, we had World War I, then we had World War II, and strange things beginning to happen, in quantities that never occurred before during World War II, and now we have new factors to consider. So I think to a certain extent, while I don't share the elite's agendas or proclivities, in this one instance, they may have acted correctly.
Yeah.
I think the time is fast approaching that whole policy has to be reconsidered.
Yeah. Oh, Joseph, thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me. I'm sorry about my coughing. I've had a bad sinus today.
So have I. I've been coughing off and on. So God bless you and
thank you. You too, hon.
all your research. And everybody, go to GizaDeathStar.com. Work out that PayPal button there and keep Joseph in research.
Well, I hope people help you as well with the bandwidth and everything. Make some donations for GeorgeAnn. I know what.
I put up a request for $200 for a young man to buy him some cold weather boots and socks and a coat, because he was working in tennis shoes in 0 temperatures. And bless everybody out there that contributed. I now have the funds to go ahead and purchase these things
your heart,
for him.
Man. Thank you for doing that for him.
Yes.
That's what we need. Not more programs from government that pay a bunch of bureaucrats.
Yeah.
Sit around and shuffle paper.
Yeah.
That's what we need.
So I wanted to thank everybody for helping, and it wasn't many of you, but thank you. Thank you with all my heart.
Oh, thank you, GeorgeAnn.
And Joseph, you are so unique and such a brilliant researcher. You are so careful and reflective. There is nobody like you out there. And
I don't know about that.
We all depend.
My mom might say, thank goodness.
Oh my goodness. I don't think so. We all very much appreciate you and the time that you give us here on the Byte Show. I know
Well,
your shows here are very popular.
Well, you're welcome. I enjoy doing them.
So with that, we will say good night, and God bless everybody that is paying attention. This is an audio file you may go back 2, 3, 4 times and listen to. Good night, everybody.
Good night.